everyone, today I'm going to talk to you about how to make a yeast starter. Now, if you're new to homebrewing or if you've never made a starter before, you might be asking yourself, what is a starter? Basically, a starter is just a small amount of wort that the yeast uses as an initial step to get itself ready for fermentation. In a starter, you really want to focus on making clean, healthy yeast that's going to ferment under optimal conditions. The primary goal of your starter should first be to look at yeast health. Really focus on yeast health, and then looking at getting good yeast growth secondarily. So the question also that we receive a lot is, do I need to make a starter? If you're using a White Labs vial, they're designed to be pitchable into 5 gallons. It was the original pitchable yeast. Now if you're making a beer that's higher gravity, say 1065 or more, you might want to use multiple vials, or you can make a yeast starter. Also, if you suspect that your yeast is low in health, it's close to expiration, you'll probably want to do a starter as well. And one thing I want to point out about doing a starter is the sanitation. Sanitation is a really critical part of yeast handling and also of making a starter. So if you don't think that you can handle all the steps in a sanitary way, you shouldn't really attempt to make a starter. Remember, one of the primary goals of making a yeast starter is producing a lot of clean and healthy yeast. A starter is basically like a mini batch of beer, with the focus being on yeast growth and health instead of fermentation and drinkability. So what you'll need for this are a clean, sanitized container that's large enough to hold the starter, plus a good amount of headspace. Usually a 2-liter or 4-liter flask is a good choice, and it can be purchased at most homebrew stores. You'll also need light DME, yeast nutrients, water, aluminum foil, a stir bar, and a stir plate if you have it. You'll want to clean and at least sanitize your flask and stir bar if you can't sterilize it. If you're using something like a borosilicate glass, like a Pyrex, you can bake it in the oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour with foil over the top, and that'll help to sterilize it. As far as the gravity for the starter, you should aim to be between about 1030 and 1040 for optimum yeast growth and yeast health. You'll also want to clean and at least sanitize your flask and stir bar if you can't sterilize it. If you have a borosilicate glass flask, like a Pyrex or something like that, you can bake it in the oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit for about an hour with foil over the top to sterilize it. As far as gravity for the starter, you want to aim to be between 1030 and 1040 for optimum yeast growth and yeast health. If you start with a gravity that's too high, it can be stressful for the yeast, so you'll want to avoid this. The easiest way to make the starter with the right gravity is by using a 10-to-1 ratio of water to DME in metric units. So for instance, you want to use 1 gram of DME for every 10 milliliters of water. So for a 2-liter starter, you'll want 200 grams of DME, and you'll want to add enough water to make up 2 liters of total volume, and that should get you right to the correct gravity. Additionally, add about 1/8 of a teaspoon of yeast nutrients per 2 liters and boil it for 15 minutes. You can let it cool a bit and then transfer it to your cleaned and sanitized flask. But again, if you're using the borosilicate glass, you can actually just put it all directly into the flask and boil it right on the stove. Let the wort cool and then carefully add your yeast. Now, if you're able to use a stir bar with a stir plate, you want to add the stir bar here and recover the flask with foil. If you don't have a stir bar and a stir plate set up, it's fine just letting the starter go from here. You might want to give it a swirl every now and then to introduce some agitation and dissolve some oxygen, but you can consider yourself done at this point. If you do have a stir plate, great. It's a really good way to provide good gas exchange, keep the yeast agitated, and drive off any CO2 that's produced during the propagation cycle. Keep the flask loosely covered with foil or a cotton plug or breathable foam stopper if you have it, rather than using an airlock. This will improve the gas exchange. At this point, you want to let the yeast grow for 24 to 48 hours, and once that's complete, you can either pitch the yeast directly into your wort, or you can refrigerate the starter and let the yeast settle out so you can decant off some of the liquid if you choose. But remember, you always want to have good yeast handling and sanitary practices throughout this whole process. A few questions about starters. What's the best starter size? The thing to really remember about starter size is that the inoculation or pitch rate of the starter has a lot to do with the rate of yeast growth. So ideally you want to grow your yeast in the right amount of wort to give you both optimal yeast health, which is low stress, and a good amount of growth. A yield factor is a number used a lot in propagation, and that's just a measure of cell growth versus the amount of extract or sugar consumed by the yeast. It's a good indicator of the effectiveness of the propagation. The calculation for yield factor is the final cell count in million cells per mil minus the initial cell count in million cells per mil, and all of that is divided by the change in gravity in degrees Plato, not specific gravity. So for instance, if you pitch a 1 liter starter with 100 billion cells, which is the equivalent of our 1 vial, that's about 1 million cells per mil. If that starter then grows to 152 million cells per mil, and the gravity has dropped 7 degrees Plato, the yield factor would look like this. So the higher the yield factor, the more efficiently the yeast grows. In a true propagation, like we do in the lab, you really aim to achieve a growth factor of about 20 or more, which indicates aerobic growth. But most homebrewer starters won't achieve that kind of growth, since there's always some anaerobic fermentation even in this process. So you'll want to look at between a yield factor of 7 and 10. And looking at the yield factor here for the different starter volumes, you can see the difference in inoculation rate as well as the yield that you get. As I mentioned before, the higher the yield factor, the better the propagation rate. This is why choosing the correct starter volume is so important. You can see here that between 1 and 2 liters is the best, with 1.5 and 2 liters having the highest yield factors in these figures. So remember, always have good yeast handling and sanitary practices throughout the entire process to keep your yeast clean and healthy. And those are our tips and tricks to making a great yeast starter. Hope you enjoy.